Hospitals are meant to save lives, not destroy them. But for Dr. Julian Carter, one patient would change everything. Adrian Myers, a 19-year-old motocross star, arrived in the ER after a brutal crash, and from the moment their eyes met, nothing was the same. What started as routine care spiraled into something forbidden. Secret touches, stolen glances, and moments that broke every rule. But when the hospital's security cameras revealed their affair, the fallout was devastating. Julian's career, his freedom, and their future were put on the line. And Adrian's promise to wait for him only made the heartbreak more unbearable. How far would you go for forbidden love? This is their story, raw, reckless, and unforgettable. The hospital was unusually quiet for a Friday night, but the calm didn't last long. The emergency doors flew open, and the sound of rushing wheels pierced the air. A stretcher came barreling in, carrying a young man covered in dirt, his helmet dangling loosely from his side. Dr. Julian Carter stepped forward, his towering figure and calm demeanor commanding the room. "What's the situation?" he asked, his deep voice cutting through the chaos. "Motorcycle accident," a paramedic replied. "Lost control on a dirt track, went straight into a barrier. Fractured ribs, possible internal bleeding." Julian's sharp eyes scanned the young man's face, and for a moment, he froze. Underneath the scratches and bruises was a boyishly handsome face, full of pain but oddly serene. "What's your name?" Julian asked, leaning closer as they wheeled the patient into a trauma room. "Adrian," the young man whispered, his voice barely audible. His gaze met Julian's, and something unspoken passed between them, a spark that made Julian's chest tighten. Shaking off the strange feeling, Julian turned to his team. "Let's move. Full trauma workup, x-rays, CT scan, IV fluids now." As the team worked around him, Julian couldn't ignore the way Adrian's eyes followed him. Even in his pain, the boy seemed focused on him, his stare magnetic and unsettling. Julian's professionalism fought to surface, but something about Adrian's vulnerability stirred a protectiveness, and something more that he hadn't felt in years. After stabilizing Adrian, Julian visited his room later that evening to check on his progress. The young man was propped up in bed, his hospital gown loose around his lean, athletic frame. "You're the doctor who saved me," Adrian said softly, his lips curving into a weak smile. Julian chuckled, trying to maintain his usual detached demeanor. "I was just doing my job." "Does your job always involve staring like that?" Adrian asked, his boldness catching Julian off guard. Julian cleared his throat, feeling a heat rise in his chest. "You should rest," he said, avoiding the question. But as he turned to leave, Adrian's voice stopped him. "Don't go." The vulnerability in those two words rooted Julian in place. Against his better judgment, he turned back, his hand lingering on the doorframe. The way Adrian looked at him, with equal parts gratitude and something deeper, made it impossible to walk away. That night, as Julian lay in his apartment, he couldn't shake the memory of Adrian's gaze. It lingered in his mind like a dangerous temptation, a reminder of the line he could never cross. But deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. The next morning, Julian returned to work earlier than usual. He told himself it was just another day, but his restless sleep betrayed the truth. Adrian Myers occupied his thoughts in a way no patient ever had. He hated himself for it, yet he couldn't stop the pull. As he approached Adrian's room, he slowed his pace. Through the small window on the door, he saw the young man sitting up, his messy blonde hair catching the morning light. Adrian looked better, stronger, but his face still bore the marks of the accident. Julian took a deep breath and stepped inside. "You're back," Adrian said, his voice carrying a note of surprise and something more. His eyes lit up when he saw Julian, a stark contrast to the pale hospital walls. "I always check on my patients," Julian replied, keeping his tone neutral as he picked up the chart at the foot of the bed. He focused on the notes, trying to ignore how Adrian's gaze seemed to burn through him. "Do you always bring coffee to your patients too?" Adrian teased, pointing to the cup in Julian's hand. Julian blinked, realizing he'd unconsciously brought his own coffee in. He chuckled, shaking his head. "No, but it seems I wasn't fully awake yet. How are you feeling?" "Better, thanks to you," Adrian said. "But these hospital rooms are boring as hell. No TV, no phone, nothing to do but stare at the ceiling or wait for you to come back." Julian paused, the casual confession making his chest tighten. He glanced at Adrian, who was watching him with a soft, almost playful smile. "Well, I'm sure your friends and family will be here soon to keep you company." Adrian's smile faded slightly. "Not really. My parents are busy, and most of my friends are back on the circuit." The emptiness in Adrian's voice tugged at Julian's heart. He shouldn't care, shouldn't feel this connection, but he did. Against his better judgment, he sat down in the chair by the bed. "You're a motocross racer?" Adrian nodded. "Yeah, been riding since I was a kid. This was my first big accident, though. Guess I pushed too hard." Julian frowned. Pushing limits is one thing, but risking your life. He stopped himself, realizing his tone had shifted from professional to personal. Adrian raised an eyebrow. "What about you, doctor? Carter, ever take risks?" Julian froze, the weight of the question hanging in the air. For years, he'd prided himself on control, discipline, and a life free of unnecessary risks. But in this moment, sitting across from Adrian, he felt the boundaries of that control slipping. "I try not to," Julian said finally, his voice quieter. Adrian smirked, leaning back against the pillows. "That's too bad. Sometimes risks lead to the best rewards." Julian didn't respond, but the words lingered. He stood abruptly, feeling the need to put distance between them. "Get some rest, Adrian. I'll check on you later." As he left the room, his pulse raced. He knew this was dangerous, knew that getting too close could ruin everything he'd worked for. But deep down, he also knew it wouldn't be the last time he lingered by Adrian's bedside. That night, as he sat alone in his office, reviewing patient charts, he found himself glancing at Adrian's file more often than he should. His hand hovered over the phone, debating whether to call for an update from the night shift. He knew he shouldn't, but the pull was undeniable. Julian leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. He couldn't let this happen. Adrian was his patient, and the hospital was no place for blurred lines. But as much as he tried to convince himself, the memory of Adrian's smile and the way his voice lingered in the air told him otherwise. The battle between his mind and his heart had begun, and Julian wasn't sure which side would win. Julian thought he could avoid Adrian, convincing himself that distance would erase the thoughts that haunted him. But by midday, the pull was too strong. He told himself he was just checking on his patient, nothing more. But as he walked down the corridor to Adrian's room, his heart pounded in his chest. When he entered, Adrian was sitting up in bed, his arm in a sling, but otherwise looking far better than the bloodied figure that had come through the ER doors days before. His smile was immediate and infectious. Dr. Carter, Adrian greeted, his voice light but carrying a warmth that Julian couldn't ignore. You're making a habit of visiting me. I should be flattered. Julian cleared his throat, trying to suppress the smile tugging at his lips. I make a habit of checking on all my patients. Adrian tilted his head, his eyes narrowing playfully. I don't see you checking on the guy down the hall with the broken leg as often. Julian opened his mouth to reply, but found himself at a loss for words. Adrian had a way of disarming him, breaking down his carefully constructed walls. How's the pain? Julian asked instead, moving to check the IV drip. Manageable, Adrian said, watching him closely. Though I wouldn't mind a distraction. Maybe some company. Julian froze, his hand lingering on the bed rail. He shouldn't stay. He knew that. But the quiet vulnerability in Adrian's voice pulled at something deep inside him. Against his better judgment, he sat down in the chair beside the bed. Tell me about racing, Julian said, hoping to steer the conversation into safer territory. Adrian's face lit up. It's everything to me. The speed, the adrenaline, it's like nothing else in the world. When I'm on the track, it's just me and the bike. Nothing else matters. Julian nodded, his eyes softening as he listened. Sounds dangerous. It is, Adrian admitted with a smirk. But isn't everything worth doing a little dangerous? Julian felt the words hit him harder than they should have. Not everything, he said quietly, his gaze dropping to the floor. Adrian leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone. What about you, Doctor? Carter, what's the most dangerous thing you've ever done? Julian looked up, his breath catching when he saw the intensity in Adrian's eyes. He hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. I'm not sure I should answer that. Adrian smiled, leaning back against the pillows. Fair enough, but something tells me you're not as careful as you let on. Julian stood abruptly, needing to create space between them. You should rest. Your body needs time to heal. Is that the doctor talking, or the man who doesn't want to admit he's curious? Adrian asked, his voice laced with both challenge and charm. Julian turned to face him, his expression carefully neutral. It's the doctor, he said firmly, though the rapid beat of his heart betrayed him. As he left the room, he felt Adrian's eyes on him, a weight that stayed with him long after he'd walked away. He returned to his office, closing the door behind him and leaning against it. He knew he was walking a dangerous line, one that could ruin everything if he crossed it. But every time he tried to pull away, Adrian's words, his smile, his gaze pulled him back. That night, as the hospital quieted and the hallways grew empty, Julian found himself unable to focus. He told himself it was wrong, that it couldn't go any further. But deep down, he knew it already had. It was late, and the hospital was cloaked in an eerie stillness. Julian had told himself he wouldn't visit Adrian again that night. Yet here he was, standing outside the door to his room. He could feel the pull, irrational and dangerous, but impossible to ignore. Taking a steadying breath, he pushed the door open. Adrian looked up, his face lighting up when he saw Julian. Couldn't stay away, huh? He teased, his voice low but filled with warmth. Julian stepped inside, shutting the door softly behind him. Just checking in, he said, keeping his tone professional, though his heart betrayed him, racing at the sight of Adrian's messy blonde hair and the way the hospital gown hung loosely on his lean frame. Checking in, or making sure I'm still thinking about you? Adrian asked, his smirk sending a rush of heat through Julian's chest. Julian sighed, running a hand through his short, cropped hair. Adrian, we can't what? Talk? Look at each other? Feel something? Adrian's voice softened, and he leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking onto Julian's. Because I know you feel it too, every time you're here. Julian's breath hitched. He should leave, he knew that, but his feet stayed rooted to the floor. This isn't right, he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Does it feel wrong? Adrian challenged, his boldness tempered by a hint of vulnerability. Julian hesitated, his resolve weakening with each passing second. The air between them was thick with unspoken words and unacknowledged desires. Slowly, he moved to sit in the chair by Adrian's bed, the distance between them shrinking. Adrian reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against Julian's hand. The touch was innocent enough, but it sent a jolt through Julian's entire body. And he didn't pull away. Instead, he let Adrian's hand linger, the warmth of his touch seeping into his skin. You're the only thing that's made this bearable, Adrian admitted softly, his eyes searching Julian's. Not just the accident, but everything. You make me feel alive. Julian closed his eyes, torn between his duty and his heart. He knew this was crossing a line that could destroy his career, his reputation, everything he'd built. But when he opened his eyes and saw the raw honesty in Adrian's gaze, he couldn't deny the pull any longer. Before he could think better of it, Julian leaned forward, his hand cupping Adrian's cheek. The kiss was soft, hesitant, and charged with 1,000 unspoken emotions. For a moment, time seemed to stand still, the sterile hospital room fading into the background. When they pulled apart, Adrian's smile was small but radiant. I knew you felt it, he whispered. Julian stood abruptly, the weight of what they'd just done crashing down on him. This can't happen, he said, his voice firm but tinged with regret. But it already did, Adrian replied, his tone gentle but resolute. Julian didn't respond. He turned and left the room, his mind racing and his heart in turmoil. As he walked down the empty hallway, he felt the heavy weight of guilt pressing down on him. He knew he was in too deep. And the worst part? He didn't want to stop. The following days were a blur of confusion and suppressed emotions for Julian. He threw himself into his work, avoiding Adrian's room as much as possible. Yet every time he passed by, he felt the pull, a magnetic force that made his heart ache. Adrian, however, wasn't deterred by Julian's distance. His eyes followed Julian whenever he caught sight of him, a quiet determination in his gaze. It wasn't long before the inevitable happened. Julian entered Adrian's room late one evening, unable to resist any longer. Adrian was sitting upright, reading a book one of the nurses had given him. When he saw Julian, his face broke into a smile. I was starting to think you'd forgotten about me. Julian closed the door behind him, leaning against it for a moment. I've been busy, he said, his voice lacking conviction. Busy avoiding me, Adrian countered, setting the book aside. You don't have to, you know. I'm not going to bite. Julian sighed, running a hand over his face. Adrian, whatever this is, it can't happen. Adrian raised an eyebrow. Why not? Because I'm your patient? Because someone might find out? Or because you're scared of how you feel? Julian's breath caught at the rawness of Adrian's words. He opened his mouth to respond, but found himself at a loss. Adrian stood slowly, wincing slightly as he shifted his weight. Let me make this simple, Adrian said, his voice soft but firm. I like you, Julian, more than I probably should. And I think you like me, too. So either we face this or you walk out that door and never look back. Julian's pulse raced as Adrian closed the distance between them. You don't understand what's at stake, he said quietly. Then tell me, Adrian whispered, his eyes searching Julian's. Julian hesitated, his resolve crumbling under Adrian's gaze. Before he could stop himself, he reached out, his hand brushing against Adrian's cheek. I could lose everything, he admitted, his voice barely audible. Adrian leaned into Julian's touch, his eyes softening. Then why are you still here? Julian didn't have an answer. Instead, he closed the remaining distance between them, capturing Adrian's lips in a kiss that was both desperate and tender. Adrian responded eagerly, his hands gripping Julian's shirt as he pulled him closer. The world outside the room ceased to exist as they lost themselves in each other. For the first time in years, Julian felt alive, the weight of his responsibilities momentarily forgotten. When they finally pulled apart, Adrian rested his forehead against Julian's. Stay, he whispered, his voice filled with longing. Julian swallowed hard, torn between his desires and his conscience. I can't, he said, his voice breaking. But as he left the room that night, he knew one thing for certain. He was already too far gone to turn back. Unbeknownst to either of them, the small, blinking light of a security camera outside Adrian's room captured every moment. The days that followed were a chaotic mix of longing and paranoia for Julian. He continued to visit Adrian late at night, each encounter pulling them deeper into a relationship that neither of them could control. They would steal kisses in the dim glow of the hospital room, their conversations veering between playful teasing and heartfelt confessions. But beneath the surface, an unease began to creep in. Julian couldn't ignore the feeling that they were being watched, even if there was no immediate evidence. The weight of his actions pressed down on him during every shift, but it wasn't enough to keep him away. Adrian, on the other hand, seemed unconcerned about the risks. He was young, fearless, and deeply enamored with Julian. You worry too much, he said one evening as Julian sat beside his bed, his head in his hands. I have to worry, Julian replied, his voice tight. If anyone finds out about this, about us. He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Adrian reached out, his hand covering Julian's. Let them, he said softly. I don't care what they think. You're worth it. Julian looked at him, his heart aching at the sincerity in Adrian's voice. You don't understand. This isn't just about losing my job. There are laws, ethics, things that could ruin me, ruin us. Adrian shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. Then we'll deal with it, together. Julian wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that their connection could withstand the weight of the world. But deep down, he knew it wasn't that simple. Still, he couldn't bring himself to end things. The way Adrian looked at him, like he was the only person in the world who mattered, was something he couldn't walk away from. That night, as they shared another stolen moment, Julian allowed himself to forget the consequences. Adrian's lips were warm against his hands steady and sure as they traced the lines of Julian's face. It felt perfect, until the door suddenly creaked open. Julian froze, his heart pounding in his chest. A nurse stood in the doorway, her eyes wide with shock. Doctor! Carter, she stammered, her gaze flicking between Julian and Adrian. It's not what it looks like, Julian began, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. The nurse didn't respond. She turned and hurried down the hallway, leaving Julian and Adrian in stunned silence.
Adrian reached for Julian's hand, his grip firm. "We'll figure this out," he said, his voice steady. But Julian wasn't so sure. As the reality of the situation sank in, he felt the walls of his carefully constructed life begin to crumble. What neither of them realized was that the nurse wasn't the only witness. The security cameras had captured every moment, and the footage was already making its way into the wrong hands.
Julian sat in his apartment, staring blankly at the walls. The weight of what had happened crushed him, his career, his reputation, his entire life. It was all gone in a matter of hours. The knock on his door startled him out of his daze. When he opened it, Adrian was standing there, pale and breathless. "I had to find you," Adrian said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Adrian, you shouldn't be here," Julian said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "I know what happened," Adrian said, his tone urgent. "This is my fault. I'll tell them it was me. I'll take the blame." Julian shook his head, his expression softening. "No, Adrian. It's not your fault. I made my choices, and now I have to face the consequences." Adrian grabbed his hands, his eyes filled with determination. "I won't let you go through this alone. I care about you, Julian. That hasn't changed." Julian's chest ached at the sincerity in Adrian's words. He pulled Adrian into a tight embrace, knowing it might be the last moment they would share for a long time. The next day, Julian's worst fear came true. The authorities arrived at his door with a warrant. He was arrested for violating professional boundaries with a patient, and the image of him being led away in handcuffs quickly spread. Adrian watched the news in horror, helpless as the media tore Julian apart. At the hospital, nurses whispered about the scandal, and doctors avoided his room entirely. Determined to fight for Julian, Adrian reached out to a lawyer. But every call he made seemed to lead to the same conclusion. The evidence was damning. "I'll wait," Adrian whispered to himself late at night, staring out of his hospital window. "No matter how long it takes, I'll wait for him." The thought gave him strength, but the ache in his chest didn't fade. The courtroom was cold and impersonal as Julian stood before the judge, his head bowed. The verdict was swift. Guilty. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison and the permanent loss of his medical license. Adrian was there, sitting silently in the back of the room. When Julian was escorted out, their eyes met one last time. Adrian mouthed, "I'll wait," and Julian gave him a small, grateful nod before disappearing through the doors. In the months that followed, Adrian visited Julian every chance he could. Their conversations through the thick glass of the visitation room were brief but filled with hope. "When you get out, we'll start over," Adrian said during one visit, his voice steady. "We'll have the life we deserve." Julian smiled faintly, his heart heavy but hopeful. "I'll hold you to that," he replied. And as the months turned into years, Adrian kept his promise, waiting for the day Julian would walk free. Their story wasn't over, it was just beginning. So, what did you think of the story? Did it shock you, break your heart, or maybe even leave you rooting for Julian and Adrian? We poured so much into creating this intense, emotional roller coaster for you. And now, we want to hear from you. On a scale from 1 to 10, how much would you rate this story? Be honest, we can take it. Let us know in the comments what part hit you the hardest or kept you hooked until the very end. And hey, if you loved it, or even if you didn't, make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay updated on more unforgettable stories like this one. Don't forget to like, share, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. Your support means the world to us, and we can't wait to hear your thoughts. See you in the next story.